Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the United She Stands podcast. Today, we have Ethan Nichols on the show. Ethan has built his career around advancing progressive causes in Ohio. He was propelled into activism after the 2018 Parkland, Florida shooting when he founded Students for Gun Legislation, a student-led organizing and advocacy nonprofit. Under his leadership, Students for Gun Legislation mobilized young people across the state to advocate for common sense gun reform, register voters, and ensure young voices were heard in the political process. In 2022, he was invited to the White House for the signing of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Since then, Ethan has built a career working on Democratic campaigns at every level of government. In 2024, he served as a delegate to the Democratic National Convention and was among the first Ohio delegates to pledge his support to Vice President Kamala Harris. He most recently founded Future Without Fear, a political action committee dedicated to electing gun sense champions to the Ohio legislature. And that is what we get to talk to him about today, his new PAC, Future Without Fear, and the seats in Ohio they're focused on, and why this is such a critical and important work. And we are really excited. It was a great conversation. Ethan's doing incredible work, and we're just so excited to see how this PAC can help us really flip seats here in Ohio and take back our legislature.
Hi, Ethan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, of course. So let's dive right in. You started Students for Gun Legislation as a high schooler right after the Parkland shooting. And then a few years later, just a few short years later, you were at the White House for the signing of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act.
Yes.
That is quite the journey and extremely impressive, especially for someone as young as you. So can you kind of talk us through what that journey taught you about how change actually happens?
Yeah, I mean, it was incredibly surreal. I think going from, someone who was very involved in organizing locally and at the state level and, kind of following the Uvalde massacre in 2022, we, I think finally saw some mobilization at the federal level around gun violence prevention. He had been working for years to pass universal background checks and all sorts of bills. And, we saw on both sides of the aisle a lot of stagnation on this issue. For a long time, gun violence was kind of like a third rail in politics. And we saw, I think things started to change. We saw Sandy Hook led to a lot more engagement from legislators around this issue. And then we saw Parkland as kind of like, what we thought was finally going to be a breaking point. And it was for a lot of us, I think for people in my generation, we had kind of grown up with gun violence as this reality. And then, we turn on our TVs one day and it's Valentine's Day 2018. And, we're seeing, dozens of our, classmates, kids our age and, teachers as well, being gunned down on live TV. And I think that was a really galvanizing moment for a lot of us. But it was really that, I think, 2022 shooting at Uvalde in Texas that finally served as a breaking point for a lot of people at a federal level. And so it was really empowering to see kind of the work from this movement and not just any one group, but there's a line out the door of activists and survivors and people who have been in this movement for decades and people from across the country coming together to celebrate what I think is a really historic moment in our country and the first, real federal gun reform in almost 40 years. And, I think we have a lot to thank President Biden for with that. We saw he was part of some of the first legislation 40 years ago as well around gun violence prevention, and his leadership during his term was really empowering to see a kind of a full circle moment for a legislator like him. Something that he championed in the Senate and now as when he was president, seeing that was really important. But I think it did teach a lot about the need for long-term change and kind of how we plan and how we organize to affect change. We've had groups like Mom's Demand in every town, since Sandy Hook. And we've had, groups like Brady since the 90s that have been doing this organizing work. But especially at the state level, what we saw was, even more fierce opposition than we see federally. At least on the federal level, there is room for some bipartisan support on this legislation. And, we've seen that with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act that was able to bring a kind of, bridge a divide between legislators in both parties. But at the state level, it's only more polarized. And a lot of that is from a lack of investment. We saw for years that we would mobilize young people and go to the Statehouse and we'd testify in Columbus, or we'd go down to a city hall and we would testify about the need for local reform. And, we would get things done locally and then we'd have lawsuits and it would stagnate. And what has happened in Columbus around destroying home rule, I think is really devastating. And I was excited. I stood with, Mayor Cranley and, later Mayor Piraval in Cincinnati when they have been fighting for this legislation locally. And, Republicans in the legislature only continue to shoot it down. I think the key thing that this kind of journey has taught me about enacting change is the real need for that organizing to start locally, and it has to start at the state level. State legislatures control so much, and oftentimes we see, the far right spend a lot of money investing in state legislatures. We saw this going back to the 2010s, and it allows Republicans to, control redistricting and gerrymandering. But at the same time, gun violence is an issue that you can really laser down on, and you can see the effects of this kind of investments. Groups like the Buckeye Firearms Association, the NRA, has spent decades and invested millions in buying the Ohio legislature. And, we see that vote after vote, 50 to 100 volunteers show up in Moms Demand Action shirts, and they're testifying in Columbus. And it shows that gun control is broadly popular, not just with Democrats, with independents, with Republicans across the state. And you see these legislatures, even in swing districts, that, it may be an unpopular vote for them to, vote for open carry or whatever, absurd and dangerous legislation is coming through the state house. But they know they're going to have millions of dollars coming in independent expenditures and outside support that's going to prop them up in November, regardless of how they vote. So, we've just seen the need for organizing to be both a grassroots level, but there needs to be institutional support behind that. And we need people, putting money, putting ads out, doing the things that allow our legislators to take bold stances. Otherwise, we're never going to see the kind of bipartisan crossover appeal that we occasionally get on a federal level around this issue.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. You're kind of hinting at it, but I'm going to have you say it a little more directly. So you've spent years just like organizing, delegating, working all of this to basically advocate for gun control. You just talked about how it is so important at the state level. Why specifically do you think this moment called for you to start your PAC, Future Without Fear, instead of continuing that work through an existing organization or existing infrastructure?
Yeah, it's a really important question, because I think part of what led to this moment was we had so much dormant infrastructure statewide from Students for Gun legislation. We have an organizing base. We have plenty of people who do the on-the-ground work of knocking doors, of going to town halls, of people will show up to protest, and that's great. But the right doesn't need that. They have money, and there's only so much we can do on the ground to overcome that. We saw a recent poll from Kara Jacobs' campaign, who is one of the state Senate districts we're targeting, and she's now tied with her opponent in a swing district. And this is one of those breakthrough moments where if we elect Kara, that will help change the tide in Columbus. We are in such a super minority, both in the House and Senate in Columbus, that there is just no room anymore for us to let the right continue to dominate the ad space and the spending space. Because like I said, groups like Buckeye Firearms exist solely to continue to buy the Ohio legislature, and they do it really effectively. This is one of the things that the right has perfected to a science. They know how to spend, they know how to raise the money, and of course they have dark pocketed interests, across the country that continue to fund this. The Koch brothers have put in a lot of money into the Ohio legislature over the years, but there's been no real investment in that kind of outside mobilization to support, aggressive state legislative candidates, people who are actually going to vote in the interest of the people of Ohio. We have a few groups that do this really well. The Teachers Union, they have a really great IE program every year, and they invest a lot of money in supporting pro-public education candidates. But they are one of 2 to 3 groups maybe in the state that do any kind of investment in this field. And it's just, it's not enough, especially our friends who are teachers, they are on the front lines of gun violence, every day. Going to school worrying, not just that they're going to die, but if their kids are going to get shot as well. And I think teachers are a really important partner in this moment, but we need that outside investment more than ever. I think that is really what Future Without Fear kind of exists to serve, is to fill what is a really critical gap. There's only so much money a candidate can raise directly. And they've got a lot to spend it on. They have to invest in organizing and field and kind of building their campaign infrastructure, and, being able to invest in ads and mailers and getting up on radio. These are really expensive things. And having an outside PAC like this that's able to, raise, hopefully a lot of money from grassroots donors across the state, and then invest that right back into the work of getting these people elected. Like I said, the right has really perfected this science of raising a shit ton of money and putting it right back out into ads and kind of dominating the airwaves in a lot of these state legislative races. And, for too long, kind of our gun safety champions in Ohio have been drowned out across the airwaves. So, I think that was kind of the impetus for this, is through, discussions with, old House leaders and, organizing groups across the state, is there's such a vital infrastructure gap here in that outside spending, like the independent expenditures, the IEs as they're called. Like that is a really crucial tool that we on the left have not been able to leverage correctly. And it's unfortunate, but we have to fight fire with fire to meet the moment. We cannot continue to let the far right dominate the airwaves like this, especially in down ballot races. Amy and Sherrod are raising, I think Sherrod raised like 17.1 million last quarter. So we have the money to compete federally, but that money doesn't make it down ballot. And if you want to see Amy Acton elected governor, your $1,000 is a lot better spent on a state legislative candidate. They will run the margins up. They're going to do what's needed to not only flip the legislature, but get our top of the ticket candidates across the ballot. So I think it's also just a matter of we need people in the donor community, and whether that be someone who gives $25 a month as a grassroots donor, or someone who's capable of giving $1,000. I just need to be on state legislative races, and for too long, that donor community has not. I don't want to say ignored, because there are a lot of donors who care about and give to our state legislative races, but there has not been nearly enough attention on these candidates in these races, and that's the kind of investment that we so badly need across the state, but especially in these key districts.
For folks listening who aren't in the weeds of these campaigns or how this money exactly gets spent, your PAC will invest in let's use Kara as an example. You're going to give her campaign money. You guys are going to run ads for her. What's it look like, or what's the plan? If you could kind of, in more plain terms, talk about what someone donating to your PAC is funding.
Yeah, there are plenty of groups that give kind of direct donations to candidates, but there are very stringent limitations. So we can only give, it's $2,500 or something to a state legislative candidate directly. That's great. That is super helpful money for them. But the crucial gap we see is in outside spending. So every dollar that we raise is going to go directly into targeted mailers. So we're identifying, those target voters who are sitting on the edge. They're people who, might vote in a presidential election, but they're a little less likely to vote in a state legislative race or something down ballot in a so-called off year, So there's really crucial races out there like Kara's who will benefit from, a 3 to 4 round mail flight, hitting a universe of 30,000 voters with mail, following that up with radio investments, digital, TV is a little harder to do, but, any kind of outside ad support that will boost these candidates, I think is the really crucial thing. So, and we see time and time and again, the gun violence is one of those issues that in a lot of these districts we're targeting, like Kara's, which is a very suburban district, gun violence is a top issue for a lot of people out here. Talking about moms and parents who are worried about their kids going to school, grandparents who don't want their kids to, get shot going to the movie theater, or, at school or in a house of worship. So this is an issue that's top of mind for a lot of these key voters. And we think that this is going to be really impactful, by spending the money talking about not only, that these candidates will be champions for gun safety legislation in Columbus, but also just how dangerous their opponents are. We see a lot of legislators, especially in Ohio, who represent these kind of key swing districts in legislative races, and they really try to brand themselves as, just kind of, soft-spoken moderates. They still care about fighting for Ohioans, but then they go to Columbus and they vote for open carry, and they vote against red flag laws and all of these things that are data proven to save lives. So I think we really need to make that contrast clear, that the opponents and the people we're running against, they're directly voting to support the kind of violence that continues to plague this generation.
So when you say digital, text, email, traditional digital, are you guys looking at social media as well?
Yeah, definitely. I think, especially nowadays, social media, obviously, you guys are a great example of this, but how we reach people nowadays. And it's not just younger voters anymore. We're reaching millennials and Gen X and even a lot of older voters. So, social media is a really important tool for us as well, whether it be through, organic reach, but also just paid ads and, doing Meta, Google search ads, so many ways we can support candidates digitally. That oftentimes a lot of our down ballot candidates in Ohio just also aren't given the resources to invest in, because it's often it can be very confusing to figure out how to, run social media ads and optimize your search engines and all this stuff. So, a lot of our first-time candidates don't receive the kind of support needed to run a really effective digital persuasion program. And we think that's a really key area that we can play in, is, making those investments and, ensuring that our candidates are competitive on every platform.
Yeah, I love to hear that.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm done.
Geez, Ashley, this entire time I've just been trying to say, Ethan, you've said so many important things already. Like, seriously, I want to comment on all of it, but I will limit myself. I think it's like what your PAC is doing and the reason that you started it absolutely perfect, because I think people mostly understand that, the right is really getting funded by organizations like the NRA, the Buckeye Firearms Association, et cetera, et cetera. But I think maybe what the gap is, like how much money these candidates are actually receiving from these organizations, like it is astronomical and obviously persuasive enough for them to, buy their vote. And so I think it's like you said, playing fire with fire. That's all the Democrats have been shouting since we started this craziness with Trump and whatnot. We have to fight fire with fire as long as the money is involved in politics, and Citizens United is still, the law of the financials in politics. Like then this is how we have to play. Like I just think it's so smart that you're like, nope, like we're just gonna fund the other side, because they're obviously not getting these crazy donations from these organizations that they don't want to support, obviously. But I think it's just amazing that you're going right to like the source and, again, fighting fire with fire. So props to you. It's incredible. It's just so exciting to hear you talk about Kara, because we love Kara.
We do love Kara.
And it's so great to hear that that's a district that y'all are focusing on, and a winnable one. So just really exciting. Last point, I say this in a ton of our episodes, so our audience may be rolling their eyes at me, but like Ashley and I have learned just through our journey in politics and starting this podcast, like the state house is so important and no one pays attention. Like literally no one knows who, their districts. I am guilty of this just earlier this year. Like it's so like no one pays attention. And
Yeah.
And unless you're like subscribed to like the Ohio Capital Journal daily newsletter, you're not getting like state news. You're not getting those headlines, like flashed in front of you. Or unless you follow, Future Without Fear or United She Stands on Instagram. But yeah, I think it's just so important, any initiative to amplify state politics and show folks how important it is and how much it really does affect your life. Like I'm all behind, like I'm putting all the pressure behind that. So hats off to you already. So let's talk a little bit about the slim bipartisanship that we do see. So as we know, unfortunately, Ohio's legislature is solidly Republican controlled. We have a supermajority right now, and gun bills like the waiting period proposal or safe storage tax credits keep stalling, even when there is a little bit of bipartisan support or even bipartisan sponsors. So can you just talk a little bit more about what it actually looks like to flip that math, or even if you're banking on that at all, or if the PAC is really, really just focusing on the left and assuming that the strategy stays as a partisan fight?
Yeah. I mean, it's unfortunate because, this issue finds bipartisan support among voters. So it is really unfortunate that this issue has become so polarized in this country. So, we've had very small wins in kind of the bipartisan realm. We've been able to persuade, a few state legislators to vote against some of the truly heinous bills that have come before the legislature. But writ large, this is just an issue that the right is sold out on, and there's at this point no coming back from that, in my opinion. Especially at state levels like this, the issue has just become so polarized in the like political class. Obviously, like background checks are supported by like 97% of Americans. So like among the people who are voting and the people whose voices should matter the most in this, we have the bipartisan support. But in the legislature, it has become so abundantly clear to me that the right has no interest in engaging faithfully in good faith on this issue. And that's not going to change until we have some voices in Columbus who are actually pushing back and showing that there is another path. And I think part of that is, like we're trying to prove here, the right has been able to fill that gap, like the money gap for their candidates, and showing that they will back you up if you vote for, whatever, extreme dangerous gun bill they propose. And part of the issue is we see the NRA will write a bill and hand it to a legislator. The legislator will introduce it. They have the infrastructure to be able to do that. And there's no mechanism on the left that does the same kind of thing. So if we can get a Republican to come on board and support this, that's great. But no one running this year has demonstrated any willingness to do that. And I think it's fear because they know that the NRA is going to put a ton of money against them next primary season, and they're going to probably lose a primary if they vote against their party on this. And it's really unfortunate, but we're in a pivotal moment this year where we can elect people who are going to not only vote for, common sense gun reform bills, but also are going to address the root causes of gun violence, things like poverty, things like the literacy crisis, all sorts of these issues that directly correlate to gun violence prevention, but no one looks at the kind of holistic picture. People talk about gun control as like, oh, you're going to ban assault weapons or you want open carry. Like there's no in between. There's no one looking at like the real public health crisis we have here of gun violence. So, that's part of our platform is we want the legislature and, hopefully Governor Acton to declare gun violence a public health crisis in the state of Ohio, which it is, and we have the data to support that. But that will also allow, research from the state and money from the state to flow into research for gun violence prevention and, addressing all of these root causes of gun violence. We have to, look at safe policing tactics and, food deserts and like all of these things that contribute to the lack of extracurriculars and summer programs for youth. Like these are all things that really contribute to the gun violence crisis, but our legislature ignores them. So I think it's really sad that it has become such a polarizing issue to talk about something that's really as simple as saving lives and preventing even more carnage in our schools or in a Walmart, or a movie theater. Like, no one is safe from gun violence. So we have to act decisively right now. And that's why we need leaders like Kara. And, we have, I think it's 2 state Senate districts and 5 House districts that we're looking at to kind of invest the most money in this year. And if we're able to do that, we come really close to flipping the supermajority and being able to actually not just enact good legislation, but prevent the really bad bills from the NRA that come through the legislature. And I think that's the key thing is we've been playing defense for too long in this state. It's time we fight back and actually to show that, the left's willing to put some money behind an issue that has overwhelming support.
Yeah, no, I'm going to go there since you brought it up because I've been dying to ask you since you brought up Kara. Can you tell us which 2 Senate districts and 5 House districts you guys are focusing on?
Yeah, Senate District 7 and 13, and then House Districts 17, 31, 35, 36, 49, and 52, I believe. It's 17, 31, 35, 36, 49, and 52. Yep. 17.
Okay, we're actually interviewing him Friday. And then I think Krista Allison is 35.
Samantha Salomon, I believe.
Samantha. Okay.
36 is Rose Lansbury in the Dayton area. She is fantastic. I think we're really excited about the seat because it's one that we've targeted before and I've seen has come really close in past cycles. So I think this is the year, and with outside investment coming in like this, like Rose can flip this district, and she'll be someone who will be not only champion these gun safety bills, but also I think is someone who will really think critically about causes of gun violence and how we can invest in schools. Like fair funding plays a crucial role in this. Like we need the fair school funding plan to pass because we need our schools to be funded to allow for extracurriculars and summer programs and like universal school meals. Like those are gun violence prevention programs too. Like people don't think about that, but those are the things that contribute to gun violence at a really high level. So we need champions like Rose, and then the other ones, I think, Chris Allison's in 49, Mike Baker in 52 is a really exciting race. I think Mike is one of our like top flip opportunities this year in the House. That's the district.
And his opponent just dropped, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Megan. Just exciting to hear that, there's one more piece of infrastructure like your PAC out there backing these candidates is really amazing.
Yeah. I think it's really promising. Like the fundraising from the House caucus under Leader Isaacson, has had, I think this is their like one of, if not their best fundraising cycles like in history. So like the infrastructure is there. We need that outside component though to keep them competitive, like on the airwaves, and mail and digital and all of these things. There's only so much that like money directly to a candidate and the caucus can do, and they have the infrastructure and the money this year to stay competitive. But we think that this is an opportunity to push some of these key districts over the top and really play a role in breaking the supermajority.
Oh my God, I'm so fired up about this. I love this.
I know. I'm like, I don't know why I'm so surprised with you naming all these awesome candidates that I'm so excited about. I'm like, of course, like Of course you're supporting them. No, we're super excited, and quite frankly, like, we're obsessed with Kara and Rose. We we talked to them very early on in their campaigns and have just been like groupies since then. And we will include the campaign websites for all of those candidates in our show notes to this episode, so folks can check them out. And if you don't know your district, that's totally okay. Just give it a quick Google. Promise you'll find it, and we will not shame you for not knowing, because, like I said, I was in that boat earlier this year.
Yeah.
So
really important work. Yeah. These are all fantastic candidates. I think we have one of our like best slates of Democratic candidates we've seen in a while for the state house. And I think that speaks to both the environment, but also like the existential need we have here.
Yeah, we're so pumped about the elections in Ohio this year. But yes, there's a lot of incredible people running for elected office in Ohio this year, and it's going to be crazy. I mean, it's mid-July. Like, I'm sure you feel it, Ethan. Like, it is crazy. Like, no sleep between now and the election in November, but hopefully it'll all be worth it. So can we talk about what's wrong with the current narrative of how gun violence prevention actually gets talked about politically, and what a better one sounds like?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is like the key component of this issue is that, I think we've come to a point where Democrats have kind of, not stopped talking about this issue, but it's become, much less of a priority. Our democracy is facing existential threats. The climate is dying. We have all of these things to talk about and care about, but like gun violence is not only like a universally cared about issue amongst voters. Like every poll for the past, decade plus has shown that gun control and, common sense safety reforms have massive bipartisan appeal across the board. And unfortunately, I think part of what has damaged that narrative is, Democrats have learned that they talk about this and the NRA spends, $10 million at their next cycle and knocks them out. And, there's been no mechanism from the left. We have some really great PACs. Every town does a lot of great work to endorse federal candidates and invest money federally, but especially at the state level, there's been, as we've talked about, no investment in this. And I think part of changing that narrative is talking about gun violence as a holistic issue. We've talked about like universal school lunches and investing in summer programs to, keep kids occupied and in school and in safe learning environments, things like, ensuring we have, really good homeless shelters and things like that. Declaring gun violence a public health crisis. Like, it's become something that people talk about in very high level legislative terms about, we need to pass HB so-and-so and, talk about, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was a huge piece of legislation, but only addressed a small piece of the picture. What we need to do is talk about gun violence as like an issue that has, both become so polarized, but also part of the reason is because people don't look at the whole picture about gun violence. Like gun violence is not something that just affects young people. We're generation lockdown. We're the school shooting generation, obviously, but, you go to a Walmart, chances are you could get shot. The Orlando, like the Pulse nightclub, it's an issue that has really just become so pervasive in our society. And part of it is a lack of a lack of a political willingness to try and work on directing the conversation. And that's something I think the left has just frankly given up on a lot over the past 4 to 5 years. It's just, we leave gun violence out of the picture as kind of like a fringe issue. And we don't look at the fact that, there is so much to be done. Like, this is why school boards matter a lot for gun violence prevention. It's why electing good sheriffs and county prosecutors matters. I've spent a lot of time in my career working on local city council races in Cincinnati. And my old boss, Vice Mayor Michelle Lemon Kearney in Cincinnati, she has done a lot of really good work at a city level, and Councilman Miranda Albee has done a lot of this work as well around, both investing in gun locks at the Bengals stadium. If you look at the stats, the amount of guns that get stolen at Bengals games, out of people's cars, insane. Not something you would think about, right? But football fans, they'll take their gun and they'll just leave it in their, in the car, sitting out even. And there are so many little pieces that happen locally and across the state that kind of influence what happens with gun violence and the trajectory of violent deaths in Ohio. But it's just not something that people think about. And people think about it, very simplistic terms. So I think the big thing that we need to do around changing the narrative is talking about this as a holistic issue. And it's something that affects everybody, regardless of age, gender, like race, class. Like this is a massive issue, and it's something that we all have to live in fear of. But at the same time, we don't have to. We know what the solutions are. We have data and years and years of data of people who have put together and proposed policies and plans for how to address this. They just have to be enacted. And at the same time, we have to consider, the holistic picture in who we're electing, which is part of why I think when we talk about making this a bipartisan issue is we can't just like a candidate who's like, okay, yeah, I'll vote for, a background checks bill. Like that's the easy thing. That's supported by 97% of Americans. Like that's not a big ask. Like respectfully, like that's the bare minimum for an elected official. But at the same time, if someone on the right is going to try and be a gun safety champion, but they are, not voting for fair school funding, or they are opposing investments in mental health care, things like this. Like there are all of these things play a picture in like the broader narrative of gun violence in America. So it's really important that when we're identifying these candidates, we're looking at the picture holistically. So if a candidate is going to, do the bare minimum legislatively to, vote for background checks or red flag laws, which are really important. But like, that's not enough. We need a legislator who cares about addressing this issue from the root causes and really like working from the bottom up to identify ways to stem gun violence. So I think that's like something that people don't put enough thought into is how broad of an issue this is,
Yeah. I like the way you described it as like the gun prevention measures, like the common sense laws that, to your point, like have broad bipartisan support. Those are the bare minimum. Like I've never thought of it that way. I've always been like, I think it's so easy to focus on those, right? Because like a shooting happens and it's tragic and it's terrifying, and you think, what if that was my kid? What if that was my family member? And like you want something immediate, and so those things feel more immediate, right? Like let's have red flag laws, whatever it is. But you're right. Like it's get to the root of the cause. So I really appreciate the way you talked about that. And as a mom, this is like one of my top issues. My kid was in kindergarten last year, and it was anytime I heard a siren during the day, or like I don't live that far from the school. It's like I can't even describe the fear you feel, like knowing that it's a possibility that something could happen. So I just so appreciate this because I think it's an issue that you can feel paralyzed by because it's like, there's almost like a hopelessness to it. But knowing that like we just have to get the right candidates in there that would support the right measures. We have the data. Like it's so nice to see somebody putting infrastructure behind this. So thank you for everything you're doing. We're going to have your PAC website linked in the show notes. So it's futurewithoutfear.org for anyone listening who wants to support the cause. Ethan, we're going to ask you one last question before we wrap up. We always try to ask listeners this to end on something nice. But before I do, is there anything else you want to say about the PAC?
I appreciate you guys, taking the time to have me on. I think we kind of, hit the nail on the head here. This is a grassroots effort, and like we don't have the money that the right has, and we never will. We don't have billionaires bankrolling us and allowing us to just, dump hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on these races. So like every dollar raised is going back out into the field. It's going to support these candidates directly. So I encourage you to get involved and donate and support your candidates directly in whatever district you're in as well. But if you have an extra $5, you have an extra $50, like this is a great way to put your money to good use in actually helping to flip Ohio. And if you care about, top of the ticket races, like this is a great way to get involved in supporting our down ballot races. And, it's all tied together.
All right, we're going to end it then with this. What gives you hope right now?
Yeah. And I think this is a really important question because we're in a time where it is so hard to keep hope. But I think that is kind of the core of what we need to keep fighting, as progressives, as Democrats, as people who care about the state of Ohio, is we can't become cynical and we have to continue fighting. So I think seeing the kind of support across the state this year for candidates up and down the ballot in Ohio, I think is really inspiring to me. And seeing that we have candidates who continue to care about this issue, but when it's not easy, like this is an issue where there are so many political pressures and consultants and people telling you, focus on affordability and like kitchen table issues. And people like really forget this is a core issue for a lot of people. So I've been really inspired by the candidates we have up and down the ballot this year who have continue to prioritize the safety of Ohioans and of young people. And then, yeah, I continue to be inspired by the students and the young people who are getting involved in organizing across the state. It's never easy. I was 15 when we founded Students for Gun Legislation. I had to have one of my parents, sign the legal nonprofit forms and everything. I couldn't open the bank account, but there are people out there who will support you as a young person getting involved politically. So I just encourage anyone listening who's, a young person, anyone, but especially young people listening, now is the time to get involved, and your voice does really matter in this fight.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for your time, Ethan, and thanks for everything that you have done and continue to do. And thank you for starting Future Without Fear.
Thank you guys for having me. Yeah, I appreciate all the support.
Thank you.